All right, so a lawsuit was filed last Thursday, April the 9th, in Klickitat County Superior Court, challenging the new income tax or the millionaires tax, whichever side you kind of come down on that. The lead attorneys are former state attorney general Rob McKenna, a former Democratic state lawmaker and Supreme Court justice by the name of Phil Talmadge, who you'll hear from in just a moment here, and then Jackson Maynard at Citizen Action Defense Fund. Now, supporters of this tax, which again is 9.9% on income above $1 million or combined household income above that $1 million threshold, again at that 9.9% level. So the hope is for supporters of this tax that when it eventually gets to the state Supreme Court, where everybody kind of concedes it's going to end up, that you've got maybe a court that says, hey, this is, precedent from initially the 1930s, even though they've revisited it several times. And voters have weighed in through citizen initiatives several times rejecting the income tax. The hope for supporters is that now you're going to have a court that says times have changed, budgets have changed, the needs for, additional revenue for the state are, justify the need for this tax. And we've got enough millionaires here in Washington. No harm, no foul to them. Let's keep this in place. That's their hope. Opponents, though, including those in the legal challenge that we're talking about here, they believe the court and hope the court will not ignore precedents, which have been clear in ruling that my income is my property, your income is your property, per the Washington state constitution. And property taxes by our state constitution must be uniform and limited. And so the folks behind this lawsuit believe the new income tax disregards all of that plain language in the Constitution and decades of consistent Supreme Court precedent. So, former state lawmaker and Supreme Court Justice, a Democrat, Phil Talmadge, has joined the lawsuit. He told the Center Square that majority Democrats, in his opinion, have gotten far too accustomed to budgeting outside their means and setting up an insatiable appetite for revenue.
As a legislator, I was confronted often with the question, we need additional revenue. Where are we going to go to get it? I mean, I was on the Ways and Means Committee in the state Senate for 14 of my 16 years there. We had to deal with those revenue related issues. Where do we go to get money that we need? Well, first of all, you also have an obligation to be careful about expenditures to make sure that what you're spending money on is actually, appropriate. It's a focused need that the people of the state of Washington have. And not just simply, we just want more revenue for the sake of more revenue, but we really have to have a pressing need to accomplish certain goals that we want to do. My mentor as a legislator was Bud Shimpo, who always said, I want to make sure that what we provide to people is $1 worth of services for $1 worth of revenue. So if we're going to tax people, we give them really good services worth what we tax them for.
So earlier today, I had the chance to interview Elizabeth Melito. She is the executive director of the National Federation of Independent Business and their Small Business Legal Center. NFIB is a party to this lawsuit filed last Thursday in Klickitat County Court challenging the new income tax law. NFIB worked hard during session. I remember sitting in some of the public hearings on the income tax and seeing their Washington State Representative Patrick Connor, who was basically telling lawmakers, you don't know what you're doing here with a tax on just millionaires. He was trying to get them to understand, NFIB was trying to get majority Democrats to understand that business earnings are not the same as take home pay. And with 85% of small businesses in our state organized as pass-through entities for federal tax purposes, many of them will end up being subjected to the income tax. So they're not millionaires. They don't live in high dollar mansions. They don't have yachts. They're not living a life of luxury. It's just the way their business is organized as an S Corp or L Corp, that it makes sense to organize that way. and yet that's going to subject them to this income tax. So here is Beth Melito with NFIB breaking down this pass through entity impact for the income tax in a pretty clear way that even I can understand. So here she is.
When you have a C corp set up a separate corporate entity, there's a lot that goes along with that as far as record keeping, things you need to do. So it can mean more bookkeeping, more accounting costs, and that's less money than that you're able to put into the business there. So for simplicity's sakes, and it's perfectly acceptable, and in fact, a large majority of NFIB members are passed through, and the plaintiffs in this case too are passed through entities. And that again means that their business income is reported on their personal tax return. It does not mean that they are keeping that in the bank and banking it and going around and spending it on, personal things. What that means is they are keeping it and then reinvesting it in the business. So they're, you know what I mean? They're it's coming through, but they're putting it right back into the business more times than not. So they're using that and reinvesting that income into the business.
Now, the Washington Department of Revenue is gearing up to help businesses facing hardships because of the coming income tax. Remember, it doesn't come due until 2029, and that'll be based on 2028 earnings. So, just like right now, we're all paying our, oh my gosh, it's coming up on 2 days is the tax deadline. We're all doing our income taxes now if we haven't already, as far as federal income taxes go. But this would be the first year, 2028 earnings would be the first year for the state income tax. So businesses through Department of Revenue can apply for some payment plans. DOR has set up, I guess, more than 50 incentive programs, including some credits for specific kind of business activities that you might be involved in. So they're doing their best, I guess, at this point to, help small businesses protect themselves in advance of this new income tax going into effect. But Melito, again, with NFIB, who you just heard from, she says their members are fully convinced that this is not going to remain a tax just at the $1 million threshold, that it's eventually going to be a tax on all income earners in the state of Washington. And they're very concerned based on surveys of their members in the state of Washington that people are thinking about leaving. We've talked about this. We've got the, small business groups here in the state of Washington that have also been surveying their members and saying, we may get the heck out of Dodge before this thing is implemented. So we've got time to relocate, potentially relocate, employees. Some people just maybe can re-domicile out of the state, but still have business operations here. So we'll see how all that plays out. But she's very concerned. And based on what they've heard from their members, she thinks there will be a lot of flight to avoid this tax.
And one thing that we have heard from our members, even those that don't necessarily report $1 million on their tax returns, but we have many members that are, under that threshold, but they are still very concerned that this is, the camel's nose under the tent. I always mix up my metaphor, so I'm probably, but you know what I mean. So this is just, the first step towards an income tax on potentially all Washingtonians at some point too. That the threshold will just be lowered. We're going to start with 1 million. Oh, this has been approved. The courts approved this, and we certainly hope that ultimately we do win. But if by chance we were don't prevail, then you better believe that I think the legislature is going to come back, right? Because it's going to go down to 500,000 and then it's going to, you know what I mean? So I do really fear that this is the first step towards an income tax if we don't defeat this in court. First tax step towards an income tax on all Washingtonians.
Now, reminder that this lawsuit is not the only challenge to the new income tax. We have Let's Go Washington and founder Brian Haywood trying to get a referendum drive going. Secretary of State Steve Hobbs has stopped them. He says the legislation, since Senate Bill 6346, which established the income tax, contains a necessity clause that made the bill referendum proof. And Haywood argues that Hobbs is altering an interpretation of the state constitution to say that, you can have this be a referendum proof bill. And on April 30th, so what is that? We're like just 2 weeks away. The state Supreme Court has agreed to hear arguments on this case. So that is significant. And they understand there's some urgency here because there would just be a matter of weeks for Let's Go Washington to gather about 200,000 signatures to get a referendum approved for the ballot if the state Supreme Court gives them the go ahead. We can also likely expect a couple of citizen initiatives or an initiative maybe to the legislature, and separately one that goes directly to the voters as soon as this November. So a lot of fronts there with folks interested in trying to get rid of this new income tax before it takes effect.